Square Ball Podcast.
Hello there and welcome to the show. It's brought to you in association with Levi's Solicitors. Michael Normanton isn't it.
Yes, it is.
Tell me something good about the fact that Levi's Solicitors back us here on this show.
Get discounts, can't you?
On?
Wills, probate, conveyancing, and other stuff.
Yep, 10% discount on all the other stuff, 15% on wills, probate, conveyancing. What do they need to do if they want to get that discount?
Is it still...
It is for now.
The Monday... The Monday Club code.
He's great.
Which one?
It's Monday Club. You're asking me desperately to save you, aren't you? It's levisolicitors.co.uk/Monday Club.
Yeah, that's the one.
Or quote Monday Club when you contact Levi's. Yeah, 10% off your legal fees on everything else.
And it is Monday.
It is Monday today, yes. Legal services for you and your business. levisolicitors.co.uk/Monday Club. It's Monday because you two are both buzzing off on holiday tomorrow. Must be nice.
Are we looking forward to it, Phil?
Are you coming with me, Michael?
I believe so.
Oh, right, yeah.
Get away from the families for a bit.
Stick you in the boot, yeah.
Get on the bookie for a couple of weeks.
Which means inevitably that things will no doubt start to happen in your absence in particular, Phil. I mean, not bothered about you.
Well,
leaving,
you can only hope, can't you?
Well, yes. So we are reflecting on the friendly at York, which is in your neck of the woods, Phil, against Monaco. 2-0 defeat. It started off quite brightly, didn't it? From a footballing perspective, I was quite encouraged up to a point, and then we lost, and it made me feel a little tiny bit sad and dented some of the optimism. Then it was Farke's comments in the post-match that had most impact, I suppose.
That was the same as Oslo, wasn't it? A little bit more interesting what came post-match, and particularly because of his candour. He doesn't seem to be disguising much this summer and is speaking pretty openly about what's going on, and I guess more importantly what isn't going on at the moment. I suppose to the football, I was like you, particularly in the first half. It seemed pretty fluent to me, and there seemed to be a good level of understanding about what he was asking the players to do, about what the plan was supposed to be. They seemed to have digested it and seemed to be following it, and to a point it was working pretty well and making them competitive. How much Monaco stretched themselves over those 90 minutes was quite difficult to tell. But they have good players and a decent amount of talent in the squad that travelled with them. It got more ragged in the second half, which it was, I guess, it was always going to do, and particularly after the changes that were made. But I think tactically you can see bits of promise, you can see how it's coming together, but it's impossible to look at Leeds at the moment and not ask questions about certain aspects of the team, personnel in particular, and not to find yourself wondering what the squad is actually going to look like at the start of the season, what it's going to look like at the end of the window. And the gist of my piece today was what to expect from this season. I think it's really difficult to say at the moment, really difficult to predict what we're going to get, and really difficult to predict what Leeds are going to be able to do.
Yeah, I mean, we'll get into all that. So let's do the positives, because Ampadu looked all right, didn't he? He's the new guy.
He did.
New guy on the block. He looked like he's going to be quite an important fulcrum in much the same way, I guess, that Calvin Phillips was in that Bielsa side.
Well, he looks like he's going to be a midfielder, doesn't he? We spoke to him afterwards and he said, I can, play defensively quite happily if I need to, but obviously playing a more defensive midfield role as well, which is where he was on Saturday against Monaco, paired up with Archie Gray, who looks like he's developing at a really quick rate. And there's the temptation, I think, with Gray now to start wondering whether he could actually have quite a big impact on this season, and whether it might be a sort of breakthrough moment for him. Physically and technically, he looks fairly close to being ready, I would have said. And he's clearly got masses of talent as well. But yeah, I liked Ampadu pulling the strings, dropping deep, deeper than Gray more often than not. And some quite interesting stuff with Farke's team tactically as well. The positions they take up, particularly when it comes to receiving passes from deep and from the goalkeeper who was Melier on Saturday. You're left back invert and Gray quite often drifting out towards the wing. You can see that there's been a fair amount of work done on that, and you can see that it's starting to seep in. But yeah, on Ampadu specifically, looked good on the ball, really competitive and combative in that area. I think we all kind of felt that would be a good signing, and I think it will prove to be.
Yeah, I mean, my big takeaway from it all was that it was just nice to see us passing the ball again after last year's shit show, basically.
Yeah, although, let's maybe save that discussion until we get 5-6 games into the season and we see how it's clicking. It's the usual usual caveats with pre-season, isn't it? That you're never quite certain what you're looking at. Now, I think, again, to go back to the piece this morning, that was what I was left feeling, was that everybody probably now needs to see signings in the interim, definitely, but everybody probably needs to get to Cardiff on the first weekend of the season to give yourself a proper feel for how this is all shaping up, because at the moment it's tricky, to be sure.
My other takeaway from it as well is that we looked pretty toothless up front. And I know that, pre-season, as we said, you can't read too much into it positively or negatively, because Bielsa's pre-seasons famously never looked great, did they? But we still look like we don't have a cutting edge somewhere up towards the front end of the park. And I guess that brings us into signings, doesn't it? Look like we need a number 10 and a number 9.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. The thing is that there's definite talent in this team and there's definite talent in the squad. And you particularly lean towards people like Ampadu and Sinisterra, Nonto when you're thinking about that. But I do still find myself asking, who is going to be his Timu Pukki in this team? Who is going to score him 20-plus goals? And I'm not looking at either Rutter through the middle or Patrick Bamford through the middle. I'm thinking that you've got a dead set there for 20-plus in the season to come. And I would also say, and I think you're right here, that while they're well served out wide with options, and they definitely are, I'm not sure that there is somebody who is perfectly suited to that central creative role. And they are going to need creativity through the middle. I think you'll get plenty out wide if people like Sinisterra and Nonto stay. But who's going to be the 10? So those, to me, feel like two really, really priority positions. And I think up front, particularly now that Rodrigo's gone, having scored so many of the goals last season, you do have to think seriously about who is going to be prolific and who is going to deliver for you in that area, because it's quite hard to, and actually, Bielsa was able to do this with Leeds, but it's quite hard to get out of the Championship if you don't have somebody who is banging them in constantly.
What do you make of the comments afterwards, Farke's comments on Max Wöber and the loan situation in general, the transfer situation, as he put it? Have we got the clip?
I can't remember the exact words, but
okay.
Yeah. He seems as frustrated as everyone else, doesn't he, by this whole situation of all the players leaving and no money coming in.
Yeah, I think as well, obviously we've had Ampadu coming from Chelsea in the interim, but the comments were not so unlike what he was saying after the game against Manchester United in Oslo. I think Farke is pretty pragmatic about how things are and how they were going to be. I think he knew it was probably going to be like this when he took the job. But Wöber seems to me to be the first real kick in the teeth in terms of departures from Leeds. I think the other players who have gone, and there is clearly this issue about the loans, and I think at some point the club are going to have to explain, on the record about how this is working and what the upside is. I think you can guess at some of it, the removal of wages off the wage bill, because almost all of these deals involve full salary recovery, where the clubs who are taking the players pay their wages in full for the season ahead. But evidently, very little in the way of fees coming in. So there may be ways in which this is helping with FFP, but at the same time, I understand why people on the outside are looking at it and confused about the fact that it is loan after loan after loan, and Wöber being the latest. There are others that Leeds would just not have opposed at all, but Wöber was definitely a player they wanted to keep. And I think you could sense the tone of that in Farke's comments afterwards, that was a disappointment for him, and it was a blow. He was somebody that they'd have liked to build a defence around. He was somebody who seemed to be giving them, from what I'm told anyway, the indication that he would stay or was happy to stay and to stick it out in the Championship. But there is this offer from Borussia Mönchengladbach. It looks like he's going to go for the season. Last time I asked, this hadn't been agreed, but there were discussions about a permanent option too. And this is where you start to move into the challenge of, on the one hand, you need to move players out and some players have to go. On the other hand, there are players who you would much rather retain, but your ability to retain them is compromised by the fact that you're now a Championship club rather than a Premier League club. And I think this is why you have to be cautious about still seeing Adams and Harrison and Nonto and Sinisterra and others in the building, and assuming that will still be the case at the end of August.
Being objective about it, you can understand the lure of going to one of the top 5 leagues, presumably getting paid more than you would in the Championship, playing fewer games, whatever it might be. But on the other hand, the Leeds United fan in me says, "Well, you turncoat bastard, don't you fancy it? Have you had a couple of weeks running around under Farke and you don't like it anymore?"
And it feels as well like there's a responsibility on the players to say, "Well, you did this. So how about you try and fix it? Which I know isn't how football works.
Yeah.
But yeah, as a fan, that is the way you obviously see it.
Yeah.
I did also enjoy the suggestion this morning from someone on Twitter that Victor Orta should go to prison for these for arranging these deals in this way, which I thought was a little bit harsh, but you know.
Did you not say that there was one point where some sporting director somewhere had been described as the equivalent of a war criminal or something?
That was Mikel Arteta.
Mikel Arteta at Arsenal. I
Was
think
described as a war criminal?
Yeah.
I think they'd lost to Everton in the last minute or something, and someone on AFTV said he was a war criminal.
Well, if the cap fits. But yeah, I think with Wöber as well, he's been in the door for all of 6 months. He was, let's be fair, he was one of the better defenders last season. He definitely was, and I'd have been happy to see him stay. But it's not as if this has been a long period of service from him, and now he's moving on to bigger or better things. He's going quickly, so I don't expect anybody to be wildly tolerant of that. And we'll watch with interest to see whether we get a classic Instagram farewell statement, because I don't know what it would say, especially. But there is, I mean, if you want to be hypercritical, you could say there is a fair amount of failing upwards going on, isn't there?
I think with the Wöber deal, just to go back to Victor Orta and his impending prison sentence, the fact that deal was done in January when relegation was...
He's fled the country, Michael.
That's very good.
Absolutely bloody run away,
It's
hasn't he?
like the 80s, run off to the south of Spain.
Costas, yeah.
Costa del
Well,
Prime.
I won't be far away from Seville next week. So shall I bring him back?
I want you to escort him back, yes.
Okay, yeah.
Citizens arrest. But yeah, I mean, that deal was done in January when it looked like we may well be getting relegated. So to have put this in there at that point, it does feel more so than the summer deals when Radrizzani was saying there's no chance of us going down. Completely incompetent that has been put in his deal.
Well, these are the questions for the club, really, aren't they? And I think at some point there hasn't been much in the way of media done by 49ers Enterprises since they took over, and there are lots of things to ask about, you know, even away from what's going on here and now, things regarding the ownership structure and, you know, who's involved, the wider 49ers group. Ellen Road, what's the situation there? Is that moving in its entirety into, you know, under the umbrella of 49ers Enterprises, which was the indication we were given prior to the takeover going through? But I'm obviously digressing there slightly. I totally understand that in the Premier League, lots of players, potentially most of them, will have relegation clauses of some sort. I think the difficulty as well with a lot of these players, but people were mentioned to me earlier about, you know, Maddison going from Leicester and Harvey Barnes going from Leicester. These are players whose value is clearly appreciated, irrespective of what's been going on at Leicester. I don't actually think, for what it's worth, that many of these players who are going from Leeds, the club would be able to make a profit on at all, because they haven't performed. It's been a really, really poor season. I think they're suffering in the way that Premier League clubs tend to suffer when they go down. But there are definite questions to ask about the loan situation. And there's also the scenario as well of FIFA allowing a maximum of 7 players to leave internationally on loan. You can still send players domestically, from what I understand, but that's them up to 6 now, if my maths are correct, with Wöber. And I think they're now at the point where, give or take a few exceptions, anybody who leaves, of anybody of kind of high repute who leaves, is going to be a player that they don't want to go.
Can we have a Hunger Games style fight to the death for the remaining place to go out on loan? I know Junior Firpo's not going to survive that for a start.
Shall we do it at York Community Stadium? Yeah.
It's too civilised in York, yeah. Phil. We'll have to do it in Bradford or something like that.
But I mean, all joking aside, the squad does need to start coming together pretty rapidly. There needs to be some certainty about what's happening, and I don't know whether it's really possible to provide that, because who's to say that Sinisterra doesn't start the season really well and offers start coming in? Who's to say that people don't start getting very serious about trying to buy Willie Gnonto? It's difficult at the moment, and I think that is why, when it comes to trying to second guess this season and how Leeds are going to do, it feels difficult to give a certain answer about that.
Well, what's your honest take on it, though? Because, you know, we've heard that the 49ers are happy to have the word aggressive bandied around in terms of their supposed approach to, be it the transfer market, the wage bill, whatever it might be this year. It feels now like we're a little bit hamstrung by this, because they don't quite know exactly what's going to happen. Farke's talking about it all pushing towards the end of the window. It feels a little bit like we're kind of in stasis at the minute, doesn't it? And it needs things to keep moving. You know, are we Are we not recruiting because we're fearful of not being able to sell people, or where are we? Because we've just had Ampadu and there's kind of nothing else.
But this all comes back to the summer being concertinaed up, and more than anything, by the time it's taken to do the takeover. And I hate to say this because it's not the way any of us on the outside tend to think, but it probably is going to need the closure of the transfer window to have some proper clarity and the ability to look at what's happened and to say, has this window gone well or has it gone badly? I think at this point, you can only say that they need additions to the squad. They absolutely do. And I don't think the squad as it is positioned well enough to, I think it's just exposed, isn't it, in certain areas. And you bear in mind that the Championship is a longer season, more intense season than the Premier League in terms of the number of fixtures you have to play. And also, if you're going for promotion, you tend to run right to the very end of the season. There are scenarios in the Premier League, as was the case with Bielsa's first season, where you're kind of safe by March, April time. And I know he cracked the whip, regardless, right to the very end. But there are games that have nothing riding on them, dead rubbers. Whereas from our experiences, we know in the Championship, when you're in the mix for the playoffs or trying to get promoted, it never stops. And you need a squad that is durable enough and big enough to see you through it. And I don't think they're there at the moment. I don't think anybody would pretend that they are.
What's your opinion on the loan situation then? Your personal opinion on it? Does Victor Orta deserve to be in jail?
Yes, let's not go down the prison route quite yet. I think in certain instances, loans out of Eleanor are not a bad thing. So Llorente to Roma, for example, is a player who you might not be able to cash in on to any great extent.
But that's what the new contract was for, Phil, to maintain its value in the market.
That's what was said, but it doesn't change the fact that you still need people out there who actually want to pay money for him. Regardless of whether you think they might, you need someone out there who's going to do the deal. And likewise with Aronson. If Aronson doesn't go to Union Berlin, would on loan, do Union Berlin sign him permanently and offer the money that's needed to do that? Possibly not. But it's very hard for me to explain this because it's not my decision, not my decisions. But I look at the amount of money that's coming back in via transfer fees, and it's so minimal that it does really shine a light on how badly the recruitment has gone over the past couple of years.
Do you see a way back for any of these players? Because it feels to me like we've probably seen the last of all of them. Maybe Aronson, because he's very young.
With great difficulty, and I agree with you that Aronson is probably the exception. I'm not entirely, unless Wöber paints a different picture of why he's going and how he's going. I find it impossible to imagine him returning and everybody, supporters welcoming him back with open arms. I think in other cases as well, like Christensen did not look demonstrably good enough for the Premier League last season. So which would beg the question of, if you got promoted, would you want him back for the Premier League next season, or would you rather have somebody else at right back? I think a new right back is probably the answer to that. Aronson looks to me, Robin Koch obviously is coming to the end of his deal. He will go. Someone will sign him for free once the season is up, you would think. Aronson is probably the one who could have a very good season at Union Berlin, could develop to the point where you thought, actually, there's still an asset there. We could have him back. He would be useful. But I don't know about you. It feels a little bit to me like these players are going and quite unlikely to be seen in Leeds again.
I think there is a football fan sentiment that surrounds this, which is, I never want to see you lot, bunch of losers again, is the honest truth, isn't it? Just returning to like the thing about all the loans, and what I was getting at is that there are two considerations, aren't there? And this is why we could do with some clarity from the club. Whether we'll get it or not is a different question, but there is the cash position, and there's also the profit and sustainability, or FFP, whichever way you want to phrase it, financial fair play imperative, isn't there? So we need to know, because maybe the club is not short of cash because maybe there's been new investment by the 49ers, or maybe it is and they need some cash in order to spend again. What is the FFP position? How do loans affect it? These are all they all centre around the same issue, but there are different questions that flow from it.
And it's incredibly complicated as well. There's very rarely a simple answer to any of it. But there are advantages for clubs of simply removing very high wages by Championship standards off the wage bill and no longer having to pay them. Clearly, there are big advantages too if you can get sizable transfer fees in, which Leicester, for an example, have done Harvey Barnes and James Maddison, although there are FFP constraints there. People might have seen that they'd signed a young defender from Manchester City on loan. The plan there initially, or the intention, was for it to be permanent, but that again is to allow them to fit within FFP regulations and limits, or to lower the risk of them breaching it. It is complicated, and once you start getting into the discussion about what can be excluded from those costs and what actually counts towards your FFP limit, it does get pretty complex. But you're right, an explanation on that front, I think, would be very helpful to give people a clear idea of what's going on at the moment. You know, how many of these loans have been enforced and done, even though Leeds would have liked to have done something different? How many of them actually work for the club and are kind of strategic, suit them financially, because it does get rid of salaries and everything else? How many of the players did they even want to keep at the outset? And I do genuinely feel at the moment like Wöber is the one so far that will be disappointing Farke, the one that he will really have thought to himself, I could keep him and he could be very useful for me. I think Wöber would have been good in the Championship personally.
Tells a story, doesn't it, that the Leicester players are both players that have been sold to where the money is, which is the Premier League, for big fees because they're desirable in that regard, whereas ours are all sodding off to Germany on loan and other places. That it tells a story about the difference in what's happened there, doesn't it? About the assets that we're getting rid of.
To this point, I mean, let's not pretend that every player at Leicester has been a success, or that they don't have assets, if you want to call them that might be far more difficult to move on. And, I think what Leeds don't want to get into is the scenario where the players who are worth genuine or big money are actually going because they want to keep them. People like Nonto and Adams and Harrison. But of course, that was the other aspect of Saturday as well, was just a much firmer time frame, or the first time Farke has really commented on what's happening with Adams and Harrison, and saying that both could be out beyond the season's first international break, which is only a handful of fixtures, but it still means that some of the key players that you want to retain, or that the club want to retain, they're not even going to be there to use initially. So it's a difficult situation. I think a pretty demanding one for Farke.
A name that's not cropped up yet is Meslier. I think everyone expected him to leave. I think 18 months, 2 years ago, he'd have been very easy to sell. But it doesn't seem like there's an awful lot of noise around him at the moment. Is there a possibility he just stays and plays?
Is a really good question. Again, as of the last time of asking, they hadn't had any offers for him. And he played at York on Saturday. But we know, and it's not a secret, that Leeds have been in the market for a new goalkeeper, which, again, begs the question of whether that's going to be one that develops late in the window. And I think Dan and I were talking about this last week and saying that one of the situations they can't afford is that they find themselves selling Meslier late on, having given him another go as first choice. They really, really need to know what's happening there, who's going to knuckle down, who is going to be number one through the season. But yeah, I mean, that is the scenario with Meslier, that in the absence of any concrete offers, what do they do?
He'd be good from an FFP point of view with Meslier as well, because he was relatively cheap, wasn't he? And presumably most of that, if not all, has been paid off now. So you're banking it all for FFP purposes. I was just going to say, actually, that the Leicester thing is not as straightforward as well as them pulling in a load of money for Maddison and Barnes, in that it was the Athletic actually reported on this. They took another loan out from the Australian bank Macquarie for Premier League, secured against Premier League revenues for the 24-25 season, and they're not even in it, obviously, this season. So they are by no means in a good place financially, are they? They need to repay those loans, and there's no guarantee of Premier League football for the seasons that they've borrowed against. So, if Leeds are running a tight ship, not putting themselves at risk, I guess you can't fault that, can you?
Well, you ask yourself the question, how do you come down from the Premier League without some of these problems? They're inevitable, aren't they? You can't get away from them. Premier League finances, even though there's so much money coming in, we say this all the time, everybody just seems to spend every single penny that they've got and more. And it's not so different in the Championship either. And FFP doesn't allow for massive losses in the Championship. You do have to run a fairly tight ship if you don't want things to get out of hand. So it's not a surprise that this has been a tricky summer for Leeds. I just think that you would hope that there would be a plan that gets them out of it on the other side in a kind of competitive and in a way which means that they can properly compete next season. But Farke keeps saying himself, no guarantee in the short term that this is just going to catch fire and, ignite and go perfectly. I think he realises that he's going to have to work at this.
He did lay that challenge out, though, didn't he? He said that we need work all over the pitch in terms of recruitment, and he expects things to move till late in the window. So the messaging from him, at least, has been very, very clear. We still have things to do, and things will happen.
I think the most interesting press conference with him is going to be pre-match before Cardiff, which I assume will be on the Friday, with Cardiff being on the Sunday, and to get a kind of verdict from him of where they are now that the games actually count and that the games actually matter, and also with it being the end of the first week in August, given that you've got about 3 weeks left before the window closes, so time starts to tick on at that point, and I think that's probably where you'll get the best impression about how confident he feels. I mean, I asked him on Saturday, are you in a position where you can be optimistic about the season? And he sort of said yes or no. He said, I wouldn't have signed the contract if I hadn't been optimistic, but I'm a realist and I feel like I need to be open and honest with people. I need to tell people the way I see it. So I think what he's saying is, this season could go well, but for anybody to shout the odds now would be risky and would be stupid. I mean, I was looking at the odds before kickoff on Saturday, and almost every bookie has Leeds down as second favourites to win the title. But I just feel like that's a stab in the dark at the moment, because I'm not really sure what you're basing that on, apart from the fact, in the same way as Leicester are favourites to the title, that it's a relegated club who should have a decent chance if everything's in order.
That said, bookies are really wrong.
I'd be looking at the relegation odds. No, we won't go. I feel like the squad as it stands is a perfectly acceptable, if imbalanced, Championship squad, and we'd probably finish somewhere around the fringes of the playoffs with it. But that's not really good enough.
Well, just to go back to the point that I opened the show on then, which was the negative reaction to Farke's comments. Are Leeds fans right to be worried, or to have some worries about the current state of play, given that we are in this sort of situation of flux at the minute, Phil, and we still have a lot of work to do? Or are we being, reactive football fans again? I have an understanding of it totally, although I am still trying to remain optimistic about the new season. Well,
I think Michael's right in that I don't in any way look at this squad and think, they're going to be in trouble next season. But you remember as well as I do that...
Is it impossible for us to go down, Phil?
Never say never in any circumstances. Usually the best way to go, particularly in pre-season interviews. I remember, as you will, the run of perennial 15th place finishes, which became a standing joke. And it just isn't good enough for this club, isn't it? It doesn't in any way satisfy the fan base. I think people will be fairly realistic about... if someone said to you, we're going to win the title by 10 points, on what would that be based at the moment? And it wouldn't be a particularly credible prediction. But I do think, as Michael said, around the playoffs, in the mix is not asking too much, but it's going to take work from here. So yes, like the 2 weeks to go before the start of the season, and I think if your manager is saying to people quite openly, it's not perfect at this stage, we've got a lot to do, things need to happen, then you're entitled to sit back and say, well, I agree. I think things do need to happen, and there always comes a pressure point in the summer where what's promised or what's been spoken about actually needs to be delivered, and we're not far off that now.
Have we got any more behind closed doors friendlies in between times? Because obviously we've got Hearts on Sunday when you're away, Phil, and missing your fixture of a lifetime.
There's also the Nottingham Forest friendly as well. I'm not aware of any others, and it's quite unusual to play an extra game in the build up to the first game of the season itself. I would have thought that Farke will want a clear run of training sessions before Cardiff, but we didn't actually get on to talking about that on Saturday. There was so much else to discuss.
Yep. So you're going to be away now until basically season starts, which feels like a calculated move on your part.
I blame the school holidays entirely. Our youngest, for some reason, is in Monday, Tuesday this week, which has meant a later departure. So I'm very sorry, but at the same time, I'm quite pleased to be getting away from it all, and I will be watching from afar with great interest.
And Michael as well, you're going away. So again, right up until the start of the season.
It's the only time you can do it, though.
Yeah.
Can't miss the season, can I?
No.
Won't want to miss Cardiff. Oh, God.
So what it does mean is that this show then with Phil, we will resume this before the season. I know we've spoken loosely about maybe hopping on the morning of the Cardiff game, maybe to do live stream a preview, something like that, if you fancy it.
Yes.
At
which point they'll have signed everybody. The world will be happy. Yeah. All good.
The world will be happy. Let's hope. So we'll enjoy both of your holidays, and we'll see you on the other side. So yeah, look out for no show with Phil Hay towards the back end of this week or next Monday. But yeah, we'll be back ahead of the Cardiff game to bring you a season previews. The previews are going to live with the show, live with Phil on his show here on the Square Ball feed, which you can find on YouTube and in your podcast app. Wraps it up for today. Then we'll see you soon.
The Square Ball Podcast.